The first sign that something was wrong did not come as an explosion or a scream through hyperspace. It came as silence. Across the galaxy, navigators from 100 eras felt their instruments hesitate, as if hyperspace itself had drawn a breath and forgotten how to exhale. Star charts that had been reliable for millennia began to blur at the edges. Ancient routes overlapped with modern corridors. Systems thought long dead pulsed back onto scanners. The Force, ever present and invisible, surged with a pressure that made even untrained beings uneasy. For the Jedi and Sith alike, it felt like standing beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds that refused to break. In the deep core, above the industrial glow of Coruscant, an Imperial Star destroyer tore out of hyperspace at an angle that should not have been possible. Its helmsman fought the controls as inertial dampener screamed. The stars outside the viewport twisted, resolving not into familiar traffic lanes, but into something vast and impossible. Massive silhouettes hung in space where none should be. At first, Imperial sensors flagged them as debris fields. Then the readings updated, and the bridge fell quiet. Those were not debris. They were warships. Thousands of them. Designs that did not belong to any known rebel cell or pirate fleet. Some bore the brutal angularity of modern Imperial doctrine. Others were older, heavier, etched with archaic sigils and armored like relics pulled from forgotten holocrons. On Korriban, where the dark side bled from the red stone itself, Sith Lords meditating in their sanctums were ripped from their focus by a sudden, overwhelming presence. It was not singular. It was layered. Power stacked upon power. Ambition pressing against ambition. The dark side did not flow in a single current anymore. It fractured, branching into violent streams that clashed and recoiled. Visions assaulted those attuned to it. Banners bearing unfamiliar crests. Emperors crowned in different ages. Armies marching beneath skies they had never known. For beings who believed the dark side was theirs by right, the realization was intolerable. Somewhere in the galaxy, rivals existed who believed the same thing with equal certainty. Far beyond the core, in regions long abandoned by galactic history, ancient Sith battle groups emerged from hyperspace, as if summoned by a forgotten command. Their vessels were monuments to a different philosophy of war. Broader hulls, reinforced with alloys modern engineers, had abandoned as inefficient, bristling with weapons meant for sustained planetary sieges rather than quick suppression. Their commanders stared out at starfields crowded with technology that should not exist for centuries. To them, this was not an anomaly. It was an invasion, and invasions demanded conquest. The shockwave of the convergence rippled outward, touching every faction, every ideology that had ever dared to call itself an empire. In the unknown regions, First-Order task forces detected massive energy signatures where only emptiness had been mapped. General officers ordered fleets to combat readiness, convinced at first that this was some new Republic provocation. Then their long-range sensors resolved shapes that made even veteran officers hesitate. Star destroyers bearing markings that were almost, but not quite, familiar. Older Imperial codes interwoven with newer ones. Proof that the legacy they claimed was no longer theirs alone. Across hyperspace lanes that no longer respected time or distance, fleets began to cross paths. The first shots were not fired out of strategy or ideology. They were fired out of fear. An Imperial patrol encountered a formation of ancient Sith cruisers near a gas giant whose name had changed 3 times across history. Hails went unanswered, not because they were ignored, but because the frequencies themselves no longer aligned. Targeting solutions locked. Turbolasers flared. Shields collapsed. The void between eras filled with fire. News of these encounters spread faster than understanding. Holonet relays overloaded as conflicting reports flooded every channel. Senators, Moffs, Dark Counselors, and Supreme Leaders demanded explanations that no one could give. The Force-sensitive spoke of a wound in reality. The engineers spoke of hyperspace instability. The common citizen only knew that the stars were no longer safe. Refugee ships launched from border systems, only to drop out of hyperspace into battle zones that had not existed moments before. On worlds ruled by the Galactic Empire, fear hardened into resolve. Palpatine's doctrine had always been simple: order through dominance. But dominance required clarity of threat. Now, the threat wore 100 faces. Imperial intelligence confirmed what the Emperor had already sensed through the dark side. These were not mere rebels or insurrectionists. These were rival empires, each convinced of its own inevitability, each armed with fleets and doctrines honed by different centuries of war. The galaxy was no longer a board with known pieces. It was a battlefield where every move threatened annihilation. In hidden temples and forgotten enclaves, Jedi from disparate eras felt the same tremor, but interpreted it differently. Some sensed opportunity, believing the convergence was the Force's attempt to correct centuries of imbalance. Others felt only dread. The light side did not surge with clarity. It flickered, strained by the sheer mass of dark side ambition suddenly coexisting. Ancient Jedi masters, long dead by modern reckoning, found themselves alive and breathing in a galaxy that had moved on without them. Their teachings clashed not only with the Sith, but with younger Jedi whose order had been reshaped by war, compromise, and near extinction. As the first days of the convergence passed, the pattern became clear. This was not a temporary overlap. Fleets were not snapping back to their rightful eras. Planets remained where they were pulled. Hyperlanes stabilized into new configurations that ignored historical charts. The galaxy had been rewritten, not as a single empire's domain, but as a crucible where every imperial ambition now competed simultaneously. There would be no retreat to the past. There would be no waiting for the future to fix this. What existed now was all that would exist. The Force itself began to react, not with balance, but with turbulence. Prophecies contradicted one another. Visions showed victories that could not coexist. Sith lords who relied on foresight found their certainty eroding, replaced by a fog of overlapping possibilities. Jedi attempting to meditate on peace felt the echoes of 1,000 wars screaming through the living Force. It became clear that the galaxy could not sustain this level of concentrated domination indefinitely. Something would have to break. In the shadows between major powers, smaller empires, and factions moved quickly. Mandalorian clans saw in the chaos the return of a galaxy where strength, not lineage, determined survival. Criminal syndicates rerouted spice flows and weapons shipments, selling to anyone with credits and a flag. Corporate war machines reactivated droid armies that had been mothballed by treaties no longer relevant. Neutral systems fortified or vanished, unwilling to choose sides yet knowing that refusal would be punished. At the heart of it all, the idea of empire itself was laid bare. Each regime claimed legitimacy through order, strength, or destiny. Yet now, surrounded by mirrors of itself, every empire was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. If all claimed the right to rule, then none could do so without destroying the others. Total war was no longer a choice. It was the default state of existence. As the first major engagements escalated from skirmishes into sector-wide battles, one realization spread through command rooms and meditation chambers alike. This war would not be decided by a single superweapon or decisive strike. There were too many fleets, too many doctrines, too many leaders who believed surrender was worse than extinction. Victory, if it came at all, would reshape the galaxy so thoroughly that history itself would become a casualty. And for the first time in countless generations, the galaxy faced a future where no single empire could claim inevitability. Only survival. If you want to see more galaxy-shattering what-if scenarios like this, subscribe and drop the concept or faction you'd want explored next in the comments. The war has only just begun. The opening months of the galactic convergence transformed confusion into doctrine. What had begun as scattered encounters hardened into defined fronts, as every empire realized that hesitation meant erasure. Hyperspace lanes, newly stabilized by forces no one fully understood, became arteries of constant movement. Fleets no longer returned to dockyards for ceremonial refits or political inspections. They cycled crews, replenished munitions, and jumped straight back into combat. The galaxy entered a state of permanent mobilization, where peace was not merely absent, but unimaginable. Imperial command structures fractured under the strain of facing versions of themselves. Grand Moffs accustomed to unquestioned authority now contended with rival imperial hierarchies emerging from different eras. Some bore older doctrines rooted in fear and ritual. Others embraced cold efficiency and technological terror. Attempts at communication quickly devolved into ideological warfare. Each imperial faction viewed the others as imposters, corrupted deviations from what the empire was meant to be. Negotiation was impossible because compromise implied illegitimacy. The result was brutal clarity. If only one empire could exist, then all others had to be destroyed. Massive fleet engagements ignited across contested sectors. Above worlds that had once known only routine patrols, the sky filled with overlapping formations of star destroyers, dreadnoughts, and ancient Sith warships, whose power cores burned with dark side alchemy rather than modern reactors. These battles did not follow familiar patterns. Weapons designed centuries apart interacted unpredictably. Shields tuned to counter turbolasers buckled under arcane energy discharges. Ancient mass drivers punched through modern armor not through superior power, but through sheer density and relentless momentum. Civilian populations were the first to understand the true cost. Planets that had been strategic footnotes suddenly found themselves sitting astride vital hyperlane intersections. Governors pleaded for evacuation corridors that never materialized. Orbital battles rained debris into atmospheres, turning skies into firestorms. Refugee fleets grew so large they became targets themselves, mistaken for military convoys or deliberately destroyed to deny resources to rivals. The concept of collateral damage lost all meaning when entire systems were declared acceptable losses. The Sith, long accustomed to internal betrayal, adapted faster than most. Dark lords from different epochs sensed kindred ambition in one another, even as they recognized existential threats. Temporary alliances formed, not out of trust, but necessity. Sith armadas combined technologies and philosophies, creating terrifying hybrid strategies. Ancient ritual-based battle meditation amplified the coordination of modern fleets. Entire sectors fell not because they were overwhelmed by numbers, but because defenders found their will to resist evaporating under the weight of concentrated dark side presence. Yet unity among the Sith was always fragile. As victories mounted, rivalries resurfaced. Disagreements over territory, over whose vision of the dark side was purer, over which emperor deserved ultimate allegiance, simmered beneath every joint operation. The dark side thrived on conflict, and even as Sith coalitions carved paths of destruction, they were already laying the groundwork for future schisms. Every triumph carried the seed of betrayal. The Jedi, scattered across eras and philosophies, faced an even greater challenge. They were not a single order anymore, but many shaped by different wars and interpretations of the Force. Some believed intervention was mandatory, that the light side demanded action to prevent total annihilation. Others argued that such a convergence was beyond moral framing, that forcing balance could destroy what little stability remained. These disagreements were not academic. They shaped real decisions about where Jedi would fight, whom they would support, and whether neutrality was still possible. On battlefields across the galaxy, Jedi found themselves facing Sith who wielded techniques thought lost to time. Lightsaber forms clashed that had not been practiced together for millennia. The Force itself reacted violently to these encounters, manifesting in unpredictable surges. Gravity wells collapsed without warning. Time seemed to stutter during moments of extreme concentration, allowing combatants to perceive multiple outcomes simultaneously before reality selected one. Veterans from every era spoke of the same sensation. The Force was strained, pulled in too many directions at once. Meanwhile, non-Force-using empires proved that ideology mattered less than logistics. Militarized states built around industry and sheer numerical superiority turned entire regions into fortified production zones. Asteroid belts were hollowed out into shipyards. Entire moons were converted into munitions depots. Droid armies marched in numbers that eclipsed those of any single historical conflict. For these empires, the war was not spiritual or philosophical. It was arithmetic. Whichever side could replace losses fastest would outlast the rest. This realization drove a terrifying escalation. Superweapons, once considered singular nightmares, became templates. Planet-cracking technologies were refined for efficiency. Instead of annihilating worlds outright, some empires developed weapons that sterilized atmospheres, leaving infrastructure intact for later occupation. Others favored precision devastation, shattering planetary crusts just enough to trigger extinction-level events without destroying valuable minerals. War planners spoke openly about acceptable extinction thresholds. As the fronts expanded, the very notion of galactic geography began to dissolve. Systems changed hands multiple times within weeks. Maps became obsolete faster than they could be distributed. Commanders relied on predictive models driven by partial force visions, statistical analysis, and raw intuition. None were reliable. Victory in one sector often triggered unexpected collapse in another as hyperspace routes shifted or allied factions turned on each other without warning. Among the chaos, legends began to form. Individual captains, force-wielders, and entire fleets gained reputations that transcended faction lines. Some were feared for their ruthlessness, others respected for impossible survivals against overwhelming odds. These figures became symbols, rallying points in a war where morale was as valuable as fuel. Stories spread faster than facts, shaping decisions before intelligence reports could arrive. Yet even legends could not halt the attrition. Every empire bled resources at an unsustainable rate. Ancient stockpiles were exhausted. Modern supply chains snapped under constant strain. Entire cultures faced extinction not because they lost battles, but because their worlds were consumed as staging grounds or resource hubs. The galaxy was being eaten from the inside, converted into fuel for its own destruction. In secret councils and hidden sanctums, whispers of an endgame began to circulate. Some believed the convergence itself could be reversed, that the same forces that had collapsed eras together could be forced apart again. Others argued that attempting reversal would shatter reality entirely, erasing not just empires, but existence. A darker idea gained traction among the most ruthless strategists. If the galaxy could not sustain all empires at once, then perhaps it should be reduced to a state where only one could survive by default. This thinking marked a turning point. The war ceased to be about dominance and became about finality. Plans were drafted that did not aim to win battles, but to permanently cripple entire modes of warfare. Hyperlane collapse strategies, forced nullification zones, region-wide energy starvation. Tactics that would leave vast swaths of the galaxy uninhabitable for generations. Victory was redefined as being the last empire capable of functioning at all. As the second year of the war approached, the galaxy no longer resembled the one remembered by any era. Stars burned behind veils of debris. Entire constellations were darkened by the absence of life. The Force groaned under the weight of uncountable deaths, its currents turbulent and dangerous even to masters. What had begun as a collision of empires had become a test of whether the concept of empire itself was compatible with survival. And as the war ground on, one truth became undeniable. The final outcome would not be decided by who struck hardest, but by who could endure the consequences of winning. As the war dragged deeper into its third phase, survival replaced conquest as the primary objective. Entire imperial doctrines were rewritten in real time. Admirals no longer spoke of victory conditions in terms of territory gained, but in terms of operational continuity. Could a fleet still jump? Could its crews still fight? Could its command structure survive the loss of its capital world? These questions mattered more than banners planted on shattered planets. The galaxy had entered a state where endurance itself became the rarest strategic resource. The first empires to collapse were not the weakest, but the most rigid. Hierarchies that relied on centralized authority found themselves paralyzed when their leadership was annihilated in single, decisive strikes. Capital systems that had once symbolized unassailable power became irresistible targets. When they fell, the psychological shock rippled outward faster than any hyperspace signal. Entire sectors surrendered or fractured into warlord states overnight, their loyalty dissolving without a throne to anchor it. Other empires adapted by decentralizing to a terrifying degree. Command autonomy expanded until individual fleets operated as self-contained governments. Admirals gained the authority to conscript populations, strip mine worlds, and execute planetary evacuations without oversight. This flexibility allowed them to survive initial shocks, but it came at a cost. Without a unifying vision, these forces slowly lost cohesion. Fleets that survived months of constant combat began to diverge culturally, tactically, and morally, becoming empires in name only. Force-sensitive factions felt the strain more acutely than most. The Force itself had grown volatile, reacting unpredictably to mass death and prolonged conflict. Battle meditation, once a decisive advantage, now carried immense risk. Some practitioners found their influence amplified beyond control, accidentally crushing allies alongside enemies. Others experienced catastrophic backlash, their minds fractured by the psychic echoes of entire fleets dying at once. As a result, force-based strategies became increasingly conservative, reserved only for moments of absolute necessity. The Jedi orders that remained active faced a moral reckoning. They could no longer pretend to be peacekeepers in any traditional sense. Every intervention altered the balance, sometimes catastrophically. Saving one world often doomed another by redirecting enemy forces. Some Jedi chose to withdraw entirely, retreating to hidden enclaves to preserve what little knowledge and tradition remained. Others embraced a grim pragmatism, coordinating with non-Jedi factions to minimize total casualties, even if it meant aligning with regimes they once would have opposed. Sith factions, by contrast, thrived in the chaos, but only temporarily. The dark side surged in response to suffering, granting immense power to those who could harness it. Sith Lords performed feats unseen in recorded history, bending entire battlefields to their will. Fleets moved with unnatural precision. Enemy commanders collapsed in terror before combat even began. Yet this power demanded constant escalation. Each triumph required greater cruelty to sustain the dark side's favor, trapping Sith leaders in an endless cycle of atrocity. Eventually, the dark side began consuming its wielders. Sith alliances shattered under the weight of mutual suspicion and ambition. Assassinations became commonplace, sometimes occurring mid-battle. Entire fleets were sacrificed to fuel personal ascensions. While these acts produced short-term gains, they hollowed out Sith war efforts over time. Armadas became increasingly top-heavy, dominated by a few immensely powerful individuals surrounded by expendable forces. When those individuals fell, everything beneath them collapsed. Technological empires took a different path. Deprived of force sensitivity, they invested in countermeasures that reshaped warfare entirely. Force-dampening fields expanded from experimental installations into mobile platforms deployed across entire systems. Regions emerged where the Force itself felt muted, flat, and distant. In these zones, Jedi and Sith alike became vulnerable, reduced to ordinary combatants reliant on reflexes rather than precognition. Battles within such fields were brutally efficient, decided by numbers, firepower, and preparation rather than mysticism. These null zones became strategic flashpoints. Control of one could neutralize entire force-based factions. Empires poured resources into securing and expanding them, often at horrific cost. The fields destabilized hyperspace, making entry and exit unpredictable. Fleets attempting surprise assaults frequently emerged scattered or damaged, easy prey for defenders. Yet the rewards were worth the risk. A successful null zone campaign could erase centuries of Force dominance in a region overnight. Civilian society across the galaxy adapted in ways few had anticipated. Worlds that survived early devastation reorganized around perpetual war economies. Children were trained from adolescence for military or industrial roles. Cultural production narrowed to propaganda and memorialization. Art became functional, focused on reinforcing identity and purpose rather than exploration or beauty. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but war, their sense of normalcy shaped by alarms, rationing, and the distant glow of orbital battles. Resistance movements emerged within occupied systems, but their goals shifted from liberation to survival. Sabotage targeted supply lines rather than symbols of authority. Smugglers became lifelines, moving medicine and refugees through collapsing hyperlanes. Some criminal syndicates achieved unprecedented power by positioning themselves as neutral intermediaries, trading with all sides while pledging loyalty to none. These organizations often outlasted formal governments, their flexibility and lack of ideology proving decisive. As the war entered its later stages, patterns began to emerge. Empires that balanced adaptability with restraint fared better than those driven purely by ideology. Excessive cruelty bred rebellion and instability. Excessive mercy invited exploitation. The most successful factions adopted a cold, calculated approach, minimizing unnecessary destruction while striking decisively when required. They did not seek to dominate the galaxy outright, but to remain functional while others burned themselves out. Amid this grim equilibrium, whispers of a final convergence spread. Foreseers, analysts, and strategists across factions reported the same projections. The war was approaching a singularity, a point where accumulated destruction, force imbalance, and technological interference would trigger an irreversible cascade. Hyperspace routes would collapse. Stars might destabilize. The galaxy itself could fracture into isolated pockets, ending the possibility of large-scale civilization altogether. Some saw this as inevitable, even desirable. If the galaxy could not sustain empires, then perhaps its fragmentation would prevent future wars of this scale. Others viewed it as the ultimate failure, a testament to collective inability to coexist across time and ideology. Secret projects accelerated. Experiments once deemed too dangerous were greenlit in desperation. The goal was no longer to win the war, but to shape what came after it. By the time the third phase drew to a close, the galaxy stood on the edge of transformation. The empires that remained were fewer, leaner, and far more dangerous than those that had begun the conflict. They had shed illusions of glory and destiny, replaced by a ruthless understanding of reality. The next stage would not be defined by clashes of fleets alone, but by decisions that would determine whether the galaxy could ever recover from what it had become. The fourth phase of the war did not begin with a battle. It began with silence. Across vast regions of the galaxy, hyperspace traffic slowed, then staggered, then failed entirely. Ships emerged light years off course or never emerged at all. Navigation beacons that had guided travelers for millennia flickered and went dark. Astrogation data became unreliable, distorted by gravitational scars left behind by repeated superweapon detonations and mass fleet engagements. The galaxy itself seemed exhausted, its infrastructure buckling under the accumulated stress of endless conflict. This breakdown reshaped strategy overnight. Empires that had relied on rapid redeployment found themselves trapped within shrinking spheres of influence. Borders hardened not because of treaties, but because ships simply could not cross them reliably anymore. Long-range offensives became gambles bordering on suicide. In response, commanders shifted focus inward, fortifying what they already controlled and abandoning distant holdings that could no longer be supported. Entire sectors were written off as lost, not conquered by enemies, but consumed by inaccessibility. Force-sensitive factions experienced this collapse differently. As hyperspace faltered, the Force grew louder in some regions and eerily quiet in others. Nexus worlds formed where Force energy pooled chaotically, creating zones of heightened perception and danger. In these areas, visions became overwhelming, offering countless branching futures with no clear path. Jedi who entered such regions often emerged altered, burdened by knowledge they could not reconcile. Sith sought these nexuses aggressively, believing them to be keys to absolute dominance, even as many were destroyed by the uncontrollable power they unleashed. The Jedi orders that had survived thus far faced a defining choice. With the galaxy fragmenting, their traditional role as mediators across systems was no longer possible. Communication delays stretched from hours to weeks. Decisions had to be made locally, without consensus or oversight. Some Jedi embraced a protector role, embedding themselves permanently on worlds they could still reach, becoming guardians rather than travelers. Others withdrew further, choosing preservation of knowledge over intervention, convinced that the galaxy would need rebuilding more than guidance when the war ended. Sith factions, sensing opportunity in fragmentation, accelerated their campaigns within reachable territories. Without the need to project power across the entire galaxy, they focused on absolute control of limited domains. Entire systems were reshaped into dark side strongholds, their environments altered through ritual and technology to amplify Sith power. Populations were reshaped through fear, indoctrination, and selective extermination. These domains became terrifyingly stable, resistant to rebellion, but utterly dependent on the continued presence of their dark lords. Technological empires adapted by investing in alternative travel methods. Experimental drives that skirted the edges of hyperspace or tunneled through subspace saw rapid deployment. These methods were slower and far more dangerous, but they offered reliability where hyperspace failed. Fleets equipped with such drives gained disproportionate strategic value, able to bypass collapsed routes and strike where enemies believed themselves safe. Control of these technologies became a new axis of power, rivaling superweapons in importance. The civilian experience during this phase shifted from terror to resignation. With evacuation no longer feasible, worlds focused on self-sufficiency. Planetary governments stockpiled resources, converted cities into enclosed ecosystems, and prepared for long-term isolation. Interstellar culture withered. Stories, news, and trade from distant systems became rumors rather than facts. Many populations ceased to think of themselves as part of a galaxy at all, identifying only with their planet or local cluster. In isolated regions, unexpected alliances formed. Former enemies, cut off from their parent empires, negotiated ceasefires out of necessity. Shared survival outweighed ideology. Jedi cooperated with non-force militaries. Sith defectors offered knowledge in exchange for sanctuary. Droid armies were repurposed for infrastructure maintenance rather than conquest. These pockets of pragmatic coexistence were fragile, constantly threatened by resurgent Imperial forces, but they demonstrated that alternatives to total war still existed. Yet elsewhere, the war intensified into something far more personal. With fronts compressed, conflicts became intimate and relentless. Systems changed hands through prolonged sieges rather than sweeping offensives. Starvation, sabotage, and psychological warfare replaced grand fleet battles. Victory meant breaking an enemy's capacity to endure rather than annihilating them outright. Commanders became administrators of suffering, calculating how much deprivation a population could withstand before surrendering. As empires turned inward, internal fractures widened. Propaganda lost effectiveness when promises of eventual victory rang hollow. Soldiers rotated endlessly through the same battle zones, fighting not for ideology, but for survival and comradeship. Desertion increased despite severe penalties. Some units simply vanished into ungoverned space, becoming nomadic flotillas that avoided all major powers. These groups lived precariously, but free from imperial command, embodying a quiet rejection of endless war. Force-based experiments reached their most dangerous stage during this phase. Desperate to restore mobility or end the conflict decisively, several factions attempted to manipulate the Force on a galactic scale. Massive rituals, combining thousands of practitioners and ancient artifacts, sought to stabilize hyperspace or collapse rival domains into voids. Most failed catastrophically. Entire systems disappeared from sensors, leaving behind gravitational anomalies and force echoes that screamed with residual agony. These failures convinced many leaders that the war could not be ended through escalation. The galaxy had become too unstable, too damaged. Any attempt at absolute victory risked destroying what little remained worth ruling. Quiet discussions began among rival empires, not about peace, but about containment. How could the conflict be frozen, limited, prevented from consuming the last viable regions of space? By the end of the fourth phase, the war had transformed from a struggle for dominance into a struggle against entropy. Empires were no longer fighting just each other, but the consequences of their own excesses. The galaxy stood fractured into isolated realms, each shaped by different philosophies, technologies, and relationships with the Force. What came next would not be decided by who had the largest fleet or the strongest warriors, but by who could imagine a future beyond endless conflict, and whether the galaxy would allow that future to exist at all. The fifth phase emerged not from a declaration or a decisive strike, but from exhaustion becoming doctrine. Across the fractured galaxy, leaders began to recognize a grim truth. Perpetual total war was no longer sustainable. Resources were depleted faster than they could be seized. Populations were shrinking beyond replacement rates. And even the most ruthless empires found themselves ruling over ashes. This realization did not produce peace. Instead, it reshaped how war was fought, narrowing its scope while deepening its cruelty. Strategic priorities shifted from expansion to survival. Empires began designating core sanctuaries, regions deemed essential to their continued existence. These zones received disproportionate protection, siphoning fleets, shield arrays, and elite forces away from contested territories. Peripheral worlds were quietly abandoned or deliberately sacrificed, used as buffers to slow enemy advances. Entire populations were relocated or left behind without explanation, breeding resentment that would fester for generations. Within these sanctuaries, governance hardened. Emergency powers became permanent. Surveillance expanded under the justification of preventing infiltration or rebellion. Civilian industries were nationalized and repurposed exclusively for war support. Education systems shifted toward ideological conditioning, raising generations who had never known peace and could not imagine it. The concept of a galaxy-wide civilization faded further, replaced by insular identities shaped by fear of the outside. Force-sensitive factions adapted in parallel. Jedi enclaves within sanctuary zones became deeply political, whether they intended to or not. Their continued presence often justified a world's claim to legitimacy or divine favor. Some Jedi resisted this role, attempting to remain neutral guardians of life. Others rationalized alignment as a necessary compromise to preserve stability. The line between protector and enforcer blurred, and with it, the moral clarity that had once defined the order. Sith domains took the opposite approach. Rather than hiding their control, they intensified ritual dominance within their cores. Entire populations were conditioned to revere the dark side as a force of order and strength. Fear became infrastructure, woven into daily life. Yet even among the Sith, cracks formed. Constant proximity bred rivalry. Apprentices plotted relentlessly, sensing weakness in masters stretched thin by the demands of governance. The rule of two fractured repeatedly, spawning splinter sects that weakened Sith unity from within. Outside the sanctuaries, the galaxy became a wasteland of contested corridors and forgotten systems. These regions were neither fully controlled nor entirely abandoned. They became hunting grounds where fleets clashed sporadically, raiders preyed on refugees, and mercenary armies sold their allegiance to the highest bidder. Law ceased to exist as a concept. Survival depended on adaptability, secrecy, and willingness to compromise moral boundaries. It was in these lawless expanses that new power brokers rose. Independent warlords, some force-sensitive and others purely strategic, carved out mobile realms. They avoided holding fixed territory, instead controlling routes, resources, or knowledge. A single functioning shipyard or stable hyperspace pocket could grant leverage over multiple empires. These figures played larger powers against one another, trading access or intelligence while remaining officially unaffiliated. Technology evolved rapidly under these conditions. Weapons were no longer designed for spectacle but efficiency. Precision strikes replaced planetary bombardment. Viruses targeting droid networks became as feared as fleets. Stealth systems advanced to the point where entire task forces could vanish from sensors until the moment of attack. The war became quieter, deadlier, and harder to track, fought through attrition rather than conquest. The Force itself reflected this shift. Large-scale disturbances diminished, replaced by subtle, localized turbulence. Premonitions became unreliable, clouded by overlapping futures where outcomes hinged on minor choices rather than grand battles. Some Force users interpreted this as the galaxy resisting further domination, pushing back against attempts to impose singular destiny. Others saw it as an opportunity, believing that in chaos, individual will mattered more than ever. Civilians adapted in unexpected ways. On worlds beyond sanctuary protection, communities formed decentralized networks, sharing resources and information without centralized authority. Old rivalries dissolved out of necessity. Species that had once been marginalized became indispensable due to unique skills or environmental adaptability. These societies were fragile, constantly threatened by imperial incursions, but they represented an alternative vision of galactic life unbound by empire. Not all adaptations were hopeful. Some populations embraced fatalism, turning to cultic beliefs that framed the war as an inevitable cosmic cleansing. These groups welcomed destruction, sabotaging defenses, or aiding invading forces to hasten what they believed was destiny. Such ideologies spread quickly in regions ravaged repeatedly, where hope had become more painful than despair. As the fifth phase progressed, communication between sanctuaries became increasingly rare but more deliberate. When messages were sent, they were encoded with layers of verification, often carried by living couriers rather than transmitted electronically. These exchanges hinted at something unprecedented: informal coordination among rival empires to avoid certain actions. Not truces, but mutual understandings about limits. No further superweapon deployments. No large-scale force manipulations. No actions that risk destabilizing hyperspace further. These understandings were fragile and unenforced, yet remarkably effective. Violators face swift, disproportionate retaliation from multiple factions, not out of unity, but shared self-interest. The galaxy had learned, painfully, that some lines could not be crossed without mutual destruction. By the end of the fifth phase, the war had narrowed into a grinding stalemate defined by containment rather than conquest. The dream of total dominance had faded, replaced by the grim goal of outlasting rivals. Empires still fought, still killed, still justified their actions through ideology and destiny. But beneath it all lay an unspoken fear that one final mistake could unravel what little remained of the galaxy. And as the conflict settled into this uneasy equilibrium, a question began to haunt strategists, foreseers, and civilians alike. If no one could truly win, and no one could afford to lose, what would finally force the galaxy to choose something other than war? The sixth phase of the war revealed the galaxy in a state that could only be described as suspended apocalypse. Where once empires sought dominance over stars and populations, now they sought only the endurance of their own systems. Hyperlanes that had survived previous collapse wavered under the strain of repeated jumps, creating hyperspace eddies and loops that trapped entire fleets for weeks. The most experienced navigators began to treat routes as living entities, negotiating with them in ways that bordered on ritual, adjusting velocity, mass, and trajectory as though the currents themselves demanded respect. Any miscalculation could strand vessels in uncharted sectors, leaving entire fleets vulnerable to predatory rivals or the hidden threats of rogue hyperspace phenomena. Commanders quickly learned that no amount of strategy could guarantee movement, only probability. Luck and instinct became as vital as firepower. This phase saw the emergence of the galaxy's first permanent multi-era battlefronts, corridors where multiple empires, centuries apart in origin, collided with devastating frequency. Star systems became ringed with orbital debris, crusted over by scorched remains of failed sieges and scorched planets. Fleets navigated minefields laid by older regimes alongside laser arrays maintained by more recent empires. Star destroyers built with the engineering of the classic empire fired upon vessels designed with pre-rebellion technology, often with unpredictable results. Shields overloaded or bounced energy in novel ways. Weapon calibrations failed or succeeded through sheer coincidence rather than design. Commanders began to develop what they called adaptive artillery, but it was a misnomer. Survival depended on improvisation, using whatever worked at the moment and discarding theoretical doctrines. Fleet doctrines had fractured into individual improvisational strategies, codified only in battle reports written after the fact. On planets caught in the crossfire, populations were no longer classified as collateral damage. They were operational variables. Refugees crowded orbital stations, attempting to escape bombardment, only to find they had entered new theaters of war entirely. Cities that had survived the first phases now lay shattered under successive occupations and bombardments from fleets using technologies spanning 1,000 years. Survivors adapted, not through hope, but through necessity. Underground networks, tunnels, and hidden orbital platforms became lifelines. Children and elders alike were trained in survival techniques designed not for future growth, but for immediate preservation. Generations grew up knowing only the rhythm of explosions, the sudden surge of shields, and the endless displacement of their homes. The galaxy had produced a culture of endurance. The Force itself had transformed in response to the sustained chaos. Ancient Jedi, who had once meditated in isolated temples, found their abilities amplified, but at a terrible cost. Each use of precognition drew echoes from other eras into their consciousness, flooding their senses with multiple outcomes simultaneously. Some Jedi could see fleets dissolving before they reached hyperspace lanes, planets being destroyed in slow motion, allies betraying one another across centuries. Their insights became as much a curse as a gift. Many fell into madness, unable to reconcile the cacophony of potential futures. Others hardened, compartmentalizing visions into tactical applications, predicting enemy behavior with uncanny accuracy, but sacrificing empathy in the process. The light side itself felt strained, like a string pulled too taut, quivering and snapping in localized surges. Sith factions, meanwhile, had become engines of concentrated destruction. Masters who survived internal purges wielded the dark side with precision and cruelty, collapsing entire orbital clusters into lethal energy fields designed to annihilate anything that challenged their will. But this efficiency demanded sacrifice. Apprentices were consumed or weaponized. Armadas became top-heavy, reliant on the presence of a few immensely powerful leaders. The loss of a Dark Lord often led to catastrophic collapse, leaving entire fleets stranded in hostile zones or consumed by residual energy feedback. The dark side was no longer just a power. It had become an unstable resource, its volatility directly influencing the survivability of factions that depended on it. Technological empires exploited this instability with ruthless ingenuity. Force-dampening arrays, once experimental, now covered entire sectors. Fleets built around droid armies, industrial-scale production, and redundancy became the most reliable means of control. Commanders invested in supply chain resilience to unprecedented levels. Systems capable of producing and repairing ships autonomously became prized territories, defended at any cost. Siegecraft evolved into a form of attritional engineering, where entire planetary infrastructures were repurposed as weapons, designed to grind enemies into submission or neutralize force-based advantages. Armies marched on multiple fronts simultaneously, coordinated not by central leadership, but by pre-programmed strategic protocols and real-time battlefield feedback loops. Efficiency replaced ideology in these zones, but at the cost of flexibility. Adaptation became both their strength and their weakness. Within this maelstrom, the concept of alliance took on new forms. Conventional treaties became meaningless as empires were temporally mismatched and ideologically incompatible. Instead, survival dictated ad hoc cooperation, often between adversaries. Jedi who had once opposed Sith at every turn found themselves negotiating truces to evacuate vulnerable populations or stabilize hyperspace corridors. Sith equally pragmatic, temporarily aligned with technological empires to counter Force-sensitive threats. These alliances were fragile, dissolved as soon as strategic objectives were achieved. Nevertheless, they represented a subtle acknowledgement of a galaxy stretched beyond its capacity for unilateral control. Cooperation emerged not from trust, but from the practical necessity of continued existence. In sectors removed from the immediate front lines, a new type of governance emerged. Nomadic fleets and decentralized warlords operated in the interstitial spaces between collapsed hyperlanes. Some became effective microstates, controlling resources, information, and minor hyperspace corridors. These entities held disproportionate strategic influence. A single hidden star yard, a functioning communications hub, or a reliable fuel source could dictate the movement of multiple empire fleets. Entire systems sometimes aligned temporarily under these nomadic powers, not because of loyalty, but because survival required acknowledgement of authority where no formal empire could reach. Such networks often persisted long after major empires crumbled, shaping the galaxy in ways no battle could dictate. Civilian adaptation continued on a parallel track. The constant upheaval forced the spread of knowledge, engineering, and survival expertise to new extremes. Children trained in warcraft and engineering from adolescence became indispensable to the maintenance of fleet and planetary infrastructure. Education was a direct function of operational necessity, reinforcing skills rather than culture. Communities that survived did so through mutual dependence, resourcefulness, and the relentless passing of tactical knowledge. Storytelling persisted, but as a tool of morale or instruction rather than leisure. Myths and legends evolved to emphasize endurance, cunning, and calculated risk rather than heroism or glory. By the middle of the sixth phase, empirical patterns emerged. Empires that survived longest were those that could combine ruthlessness with restraint, adaptability with strategic conservatism. Aggression without foresight led to depletion. Extreme caution without decisive action invited vulnerability. Fleets and sectors that maintained flexibility, conserved resources, and limited unnecessary destruction survived longer than those that sought grandiose displays of dominance. Strategic sophistication became less about offensive capability and more about the sustainable management of warfare itself. Survival was now the ultimate metric of success. Among the Force-sensitive, ethical and philosophical dilemmas deepened. Jedi struggled with the morality of local intervention. Saving one system could doom another due to hyperlane flux, resource diversion, or enemy repositioning. Sith faced similar quandaries, though their solutions were more lethal. Choosing which sectors to sacrifice for long-term gain became a daily calculus. Both sides were forced into making decisions that no doctrine had prepared them for. The Force, once a guide and amplifier, became a lens of excruciating consequence, reflecting the unintended impact of every choice across time and space. Even the most experienced practitioners found themselves questioning whether mastery over the Force included mastery over destiny itself. The war's psychological impact became evident on commanders and crews alike. Continuous exposure to death, collapse, and temporally disjointed realities produced strain that traditional discipline could no longer mitigate. Leadership depended not only on tactical acumen, but also on emotional resilience and the ability to navigate moral ambiguity. Entire units failed due to loss of morale or internal collapse, even if physically intact. Survivability now required a balance between technical expertise, emotional endurance, and the capacity to anticipate threats emerging from both past and future empires. By the end of this phase, the galaxy had transformed into a living machine of conflict and adaptation. Stars and systems became part of the war effort, their resources harnessed, their populations conscripted, their orbits considered in tactical calculations. The concept of a civilian galaxy ceased to exist. Every action, from fleet deployment to local governance, was now a variable in an unending equation of survival. Empires were not merely fighting each other. They were fighting entropy itself, seeking to impose order on a galaxy that had outgrown any single civilization's capacity to command it. And yet, even as systems collapsed and empires fractured, the undercurrent of strategy persisted. In the shadows, new players calculated their moves, hidden fleets waited, and force-sensitive individuals prepared for the singular opportunity that would arise when the remaining balance shifted enough to favor decisive action. In this crucible, the next move could either stabilize the galaxy or shatter it entirely. The seventh phase of the Galactic War marked the moment when desperation became doctrine, and the concept of strategic pause vanished entirely. Fleets moved with a new rhythm, dictated not by imperial schedules or grand battle plans, but by the unpredictable pulse of hyperspace anomalies and resource availability. Hyperlanes, once reliable arteries of commerce and conquest, now behaved like chaotic rivers, warping unpredictably across space and time. Some ships emerged decades ahead or behind where they were expected, creating instantaneous encounters with empires that had yet to exist or had long since fallen. Commanders could no longer plan operations with certainty. Success became probabilistic, a matter of improvisation, intuition, and luck. Battles were fought as much against the fabric of the galaxy itself as against enemy fleets, with hyperspace eddies turning sudden jumps into gambles that could strand entire task forces in isolated sectors. Even the most disciplined officers began to accept that control over the galaxy had become an illusion, and survival required constant adaptation. The expansion of multi-era battlefronts continued with increasing intensity. Where once engagements were confined to individual star systems, now entire sectors were consumed by overlapping conflicts that crossed temporal and technological boundaries. Classic Imperial Star destroyers clashed with modern dreadnoughts and ancient Sith warships armed with arcane energy sources. Simultaneously, New Republic fleets attempted to hold positions against older Sith factions whose tactics had been lost to time. These encounters were unpredictable, as the interaction of weapons, shields, and battle formations designed for entirely different eras produced outcomes that no commander could have anticipated. One fleet might be obliterated by a weapon that in its original context was considered obsolete, while another would survive assaults that should have torn it apart. Adaptability, once an advantage, became the only metric of survival. Commanders kept logs not to record victories, but to preserve patterns for future improvisation. Tactical theory gave way to what was effectively battlefield improvisation on a galactic scale. Civilians across the galaxy became involuntary participants in this seventh phase, their survival intertwined with military strategy in ways previously unimaginable. Refugee fleets became permanent appendages to operational zones, their routes dictated not by safety, but by the movement of battles and the shifting positions of multi-era empires. Orbital stations and hidden waypoints emerged as temporary havens, often located near minor strategic assets or in sectors partially stabilized by force-sensitive interventions. Families adapted quickly. Children were trained in piloting, engineering, and survival tactics from an age when play had once been possible. Culture became an adjunct of necessity, its artifacts functional rather than expressive, designed to teach the next generation the mechanics of survival rather than the ideals of freedom or justice. Entire populations ceased to think of themselves as citizens of a galaxy. They identified as nodes in a network of life preservation, navigating shifting loyalties, temporary allegiances, and survival imperatives that changed with the movement of fleets and the instability of hyperspace. Force-sensitive factions were tested to unprecedented levels. Jedi and Sith alike found that the Force had become not a tool, but a volatile environment. Large-scale interventions destabilized local reality, and even small actions rippled unpredictably across time and space. Jedi attempting to maintain sanctuaries often found their actions unintentionally empowering nearby Sith forces, while Sith rituals designed to dominate systems occasionally disrupted the stability of their own fleets. The Force had become a mirror reflecting the consequences of countless interwoven conflicts, and mastery now required the ability to parse causality across eras and outcomes. Some Jedi developed techniques that relied on observing multiple possible futures and selecting actions that minimized risk in all probable scenarios, essentially making decisions that had to account for both time and multi-era strategy. Sith, conversely, embraced the chaos, using the unpredictability of hyperspace and Force interference to their advantage, becoming predators in a galaxy where the rules themselves had become a weapon. Amidst the chaos, technological empires pursued relentless innovation. Forces that lacked access to the Force compensated with science, engineering, and sheer industrial output. Superweapons were redesigned for efficiency rather than intimidation. Orbital cannons became automated and self-repairing, and droid armies evolved to operate autonomously in chaotic conditions where centralized command could not function. Experimental drives, capable of subspace tunneling and bypassing unstable hyperlanes, became coveted assets, as they allowed empires to strike at regions presumed safe by their rivals. Fleets equipped with these drives held disproportionate strategic value, able to emerge unexpectedly, disrupt supply chains, or reclaim territory thought lost. Technology, adaptability, and innovation became the decisive factors, overshadowing even the Force in zones where hyperspace and time had grown unreliable. The compression of conflict into temporal and spatial hotspots intensified the personal dimension of warfare. Where battle once occurred on distant starfields, now entire planets became battlegrounds under continuous assault. Siegecraft replaced fleet maneuvers. Infrastructure became weaponized. Populations were considered operational variables. Commanders calculated the exact thresholds at which civilian resistance would collapse without entirely eradicating labor resources. Starports were converted into killing zones. Orbital stations became fortified laboratories. And factories that had once produced consumer goods now churned out munitions and autonomous droids. War consumed all non-combat systems, and survival depended on strict prioritization of energy, personnel, and raw materials. The galaxy itself became a machine of attrition, its resources marshaled into continuous conflict. The emergence of nomadic powers reshaped the strategic landscape. Independent flotillas, mercenary task forces, and rogue warlords began controlling critical hyperlane choke points and production hubs. These entities did not claim planets or traditional territory. Their power lay in mobility, access to resources, and the ability to exploit the instability of hyperlanes. Some operated with Force-sensitive leadership, others relied purely on technological mastery. Their unpredictability added a new layer of strategic complexity, as even major empires had to account for these dynamic actors when planning operations. A single flotilla could threaten entire fleets, disrupt supply lines, or seize production facilities, forcing larger powers to negotiate or divert attention from established fronts. Nomadic powers became de facto stabilizers in certain corridors, albeit through leverage rather than governance, and their influence extended far beyond their size or number. As attrition became the dominant factor in survival, empires evolved organizationally. Hierarchies flattened to allow faster decision-making. Commanders were given unprecedented autonomy. Fleet units became self-sufficient, and local governance often diverged culturally and operationally from central ideology. This decentralized approach allowed survival under extreme conditions, but it also carried risks. Factions fragmented internally, leading to rogue elements acting independently and sometimes undermining broader strategic objectives. Discipline became a balance between autonomy and cohesion, and empires discovered that their own survival often depended on tolerating the unpredictable behavior of subordinates who acted out of immediate necessity rather than doctrinal adherence. The Force continued to shape the war indirectly. In localized nexus zones where Force energy pooled chaotically, battle outcomes became highly unpredictable. Jedi and Sith attempting to dominate these regions often found themselves facing consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical calculations. Ships could be shredded before entering orbit due to gravitational and force distortions. Entire planetary systems could be destabilized by the unintended interaction of concentrated light and dark energy. Force-sensitive practitioners had to develop new methods to operate in these environments, often relying on improvisational techniques or forming temporary alliances to contain uncontrollable energy surges. Hyperspace itself seemed responsive to force activity, further complicating the logistics of moving fleets or evacuating populations. The galaxy had become a living, reactive system in which the Force was both a tool and a threat, omnipresent yet unpredictable. Civilian populations in this phase adapted to prolonged instability through innovation, cooperation, and resilience. Communities became distributed, relying on decentralized communication, resource sharing, and covert travel networks. Education focused exclusively on operational survival, and cultural production shifted to pragmatic instruction. Art, storytelling, and historical knowledge persisted only to reinforce survival strategies and morale. Older traditions and philosophies became tools rather than dogma, guiding behavior and coordination rather than providing moral absolutes. Children grew up trained in piloting, combat, engineering, and strategic reasoning, prepared from adolescence to contribute immediately to defense, infrastructure, or survival tasks. Societies evolved into operational networks capable of persistence under siege, yet fragile under sustained imperial pressure. By the culmination of the seventh phase, patterns of survival and adaptation had crystallized. Fleets and empires that thrived balanced aggression with conservation, adaptability with prudence. The ability to endure rather than dominate became the key determinant of success. Superweapons and force-based interventions continued, but their use was tempered by the potential for catastrophic feedback. Decentralized control structures and mobile operations outlasted rigid hierarchies. Civilian and military coordination became inseparable, and adaptability emerged as the most valued quality in both leadership and population. Empires that survived did so not through conquest alone, but through a calculated balance of attrition, pragmatism, and opportunistic alliances. The galaxy, stretched to its limits, had entered a form of equilibrium defined by endurance. Battles continued, territories shifted, and fleets maneuvered in unpredictable ways. Yet beneath this surface churn lay a grim understanding. The galaxy itself had become a crucible. Survival was no longer guaranteed by strategy, technology, or power alone. It required continuous adaptation to a universe that had become more complex, chaotic, and interdependent than any empire could hope to control. Every action carried consequences across time, space, and reality itself. In this environment, even the strongest fleet or the most powerful force user could be undone by forces they could not anticipate. The war had transformed from a contest of dominance into an intricate game of survival at a scale never before imagined. In the shadows, hidden players waited for the precise moment when they could exploit this balance, reshaping the galaxy yet again, and no empire could claim inevitability. Every decision mattered. Every miscalculation was fatal, and the next phase would test the endurance, ingenuity, and morality of every civilization that remained. By the time the eighth phase of the Galactic War began, the galaxy had ceased to resemble anything recognizable from any single era. Star systems lay in ruins, hyperspace lanes had become unpredictable corridors of risk, and entire regions of space were effectively quarantined due to residual superweapon fallout or force anomalies. Commanders no longer relied on historical records, maps, or even intelligence briefings from their own era. Instead, they operated on constant observation, probability calculations, and real-time adjustments, coordinating fleets that moved across sectors where the rules of space, time, and causality no longer aligned consistently. Battles were fought as much against the instability of the galaxy as against enemy forces, with the very fabric of reality acting as an unpredictable third participant in every engagement. Even the most veteran officers, those who had survived decades of conflict, began to acknowledge that certainty had become impossible, and strategy had become improvisation at a scale previously unimagined. The surviving empires had learned to embrace fluidity in tactics. Where rigid formations had once dominated space combat doctrine, now flexible squadrons operated autonomously, capable of regrouping mid-battle or detaching entirely if hyperspace currents shifted unexpectedly. Entire task forces were designed to survive isolation for months, equipped with self-sustaining energy supplies, repair drones, and autonomous command systems that could function without direct oversight. This decentralization proved essential, as fleets often emerged from hyperlane jumps in unfamiliar sectors, encountering allies and enemies whose identities were unclear. The ability to adapt instantly to fight, retreat, or form temporary coalitions became more valuable than firepower or numerical superiority. Commanders who clung to rigid control structures found their forces annihilated or stranded, victims of their inability to navigate a galaxy that no longer conformed to predictable patterns. Civilian populations continued to evolve in response to these relentless pressures. Refugee fleets, once temporary havens, had become permanent mobile settlements. Entire cultures developed on these moving habitats, with governance, education, and commerce tailored to survival under constant threat. Children grew up knowing only life aboard ships or in isolated planetary refuges, trained in piloting, mechanics, and basic military strategy before they could even read star charts. Communities became tightly integrated networks, sharing information, resources, and defense responsibilities across light years, with loyalty and social cohesion defined less by ideology than by mutual dependence. The concept of a centralized government, of a coherent galactic society, was all begone. Survival required decentralized coordination, and trust became a rare commodity, as betrayals could mean immediate annihilation. Force-sensitive factions faced unprecedented challenges in this phase. The Force had become erratic and overwhelming in unpredictable locations, reacting not only to individual actions, but to the cumulative weight of overlapping wars and eras. Jedi who attempted traditional battle meditation or precognition often found themselves pulled into visions of conflicting futures, unable to determine which was real and which was an echo of a potential timeline. Entire fleets were sometimes affected by these surges, ships and personnel imperceptibly displaced or disoriented, creating tactical chaos that commanders could neither predict nor counter. Sith, too, discovered that their dark side power was no longer absolute. In some sectors, their manipulations caused catastrophic feedback, turning allies into casualties and disrupting fleet cohesion. The galaxy had become a force of its own, one in which mastery of conventional and mystical powers was insufficient without constant adaptation to its unpredictable currents. The interplay of force and technology became increasingly consequential. Null zones and force-dampening fields proliferated as technological empires sought to neutralize Jedi and Sith advantages, while hyperspace currents shifted unpredictably due to repeated superweapon use and force disturbances. Fleets equipped with advanced subspace drives or shielding capable of withstanding temporal anomalies gained outsized strategic influence. Commanders learned to use the environment as a weapon, exploiting unstable hyperlanes to isolate enemy units or funnel them into ambushes. Entire battles were fought less with conventional weapons than with manipulation of the galaxy's physical and metaphysical properties, turning reality itself into a variable in military calculus. Success required not just skill or firepower, but intuition, patience, and the ability to predict reactions across space, time, and force influence simultaneously. Empires that had previously relied on ideology as a guiding principle were forced to abandon it in favor of pragmatism. Survival became the only universally acknowledged goal, and moral or philosophical considerations were subordinated to immediate operational needs. Decisions about planetary populations, resource allocation, and fleet deployment were made with ruthless efficiency, and often with long-term consequences in mind. Civilian casualties, environmental devastation, and social upheaval were no longer considered collateral damage. They were tactical calculations, measured and accounted for as variables affecting the capacity of enemies to persist. Even former champions of morality among the Jedi and Sith found themselves compromised, forced to weigh the preservation of life against the survival of entire factions. Nomadic powers and mercenary networks flourished in this environment. Independent flotillas, once minor players, became pivotal in controlling key hyperlane intersections, supply caches, and repair depots. Their mobility allowed them to operate unpredictably, striking at weak points or exploiting temporary gaps in Imperial coverage. Some of these actors were force-sensitive, while others relied entirely on technological mastery and strategic foresight. Their influence grew exponentially because they were adaptable, unbound by the conventions and hierarchies that had hampered larger empires. In many sectors, they became the de facto arbiters of survival, their decisions affecting fleets and populations far beyond their size or direct power. These groups often operated on principles of mutual benefit rather than ideology, establishing informal agreements with multiple factions that allowed them to persist amidst chaos where conventional empires could not. Attrition reached staggering levels during this phase. Entire star systems were consumed not by single decisive battles, but by the cumulative effect of repeated engagements, superweapon detonations, and shifting control of strategic assets. Planets once thought secure became uninhabitable or isolated, and fleets were decimated by the continuous stress of operations in unstable hyperspace. Even the most resource-rich empires faced shortages as repair yards, refineries, and energy sources were destroyed or rendered inaccessible. Logistics became as critical as tactics. The ability to supply, repair, and rotate units effectively determined whether a faction survived or disintegrated. Empires discovered that the war was no longer about dominance. It was about endurance. The dark side and light side evolved under these pressures. Sith began consolidating power differently, abandoning the pursuit of expansion for the creation of stable strongholds where the dark side could be concentrated and weaponized with maximum effect. Apprenticeships became formalized but ruthless, with succession determined not by loyalty, but by effectiveness in maintaining control and navigating the unstable galaxy. Jedi, meanwhile, faced existential questions about intervention. Some orders withdrew entirely, focusing on preserving knowledge and life wherever possible. Others engaged selectively, employing surgical strikes and strategic guidance rather than wholesale battlefield involvement. The balance of the Force became less about philosophical equilibrium and more about tactical leverage, with both sides exploiting or avoiding Force anomalies as suits their goals. Civilians continued to innovate under pressure. Starship-born populations became fully self-sufficient, developing advanced life support systems, hydroponics, and education tailored for constant movement and survival. Planet-based societies adapted by fortifying infrastructure, rationing critical resources, and decentralizing leadership. Culture persisted, but its focus shifted. Art and literature were tools for resilience. Storytelling became a method of survival instruction, and traditions emphasized coordination, memory, and the skills necessary to endure a galaxy at war. Interstellar commerce existed, but only in the context of survival. Fuel, food, medical supplies, and repair components became the most valuable currency, far above precious metals or ceremonial artifacts. By the end of the 8th phase, the galaxy had reached a precarious balance. Fleets and empires that survived were fewer, leaner, and more resourceful than those that had begun the conflict. Survival depended on the integration of mobility, force-sensitive strategy, technological innovation, civilian cooperation, and improvisation under extreme conditions. The war had transformed from a contest of domination to a contest of resilience, where endurance, flexibility, and adaptability determined outcomes more reliably than firepower or ideology. The concept of a single ruling empire had been abandoned. What remained were networks of surviving factions, each capable of defending its interests, exploiting opportunities, and persisting amidst uncertainty. Yet beneath this fragile equilibrium, the undercurrents of tension remained. Rogue forces, mercenary flotillas, and opportunistic commanders constantly tested boundaries, probing weak points in fleet formations, supply chains, and force-sensitive strongholds. Hyperspace anomalies continued to shift unpredictably, creating sudden choke points or isolating units. The Force itself remained volatile, capable of amplifying both fortune and disaster. Each encounter, each battle, carried consequences not only for immediate participants, but across space and time, creating ripples that no single commander could fully anticipate. In this environment, trust was rare, alliances were temporary, and betrayal was expected. The eighth phase also revealed the limits of endurance. Even the most adaptive empires began to face internal collapse, as constant pressure eroded discipline, morale, and cohesion. Leaders struggled to maintain authority over crews who had seen centuries of conflict compressed into months by temporal anomalies. Populations grew weary of endless mobilization, rebellion and desertion increased, and the stress of perpetual war manifested in psychological and social fragmentation. Survival became a complex calculation, balancing offensive action, defensive consolidation, and preservation of human and mechanical resources. Decisions made in one sector could have unintended consequences across light years, and commanders had to weigh risk with unprecedented caution. As the galaxy entered the final stages of the eighth phase, one undeniable truth emerged. The war was no longer winnable in the traditional sense. Total victory was impossible because the very structure of spacetime, combined with the proliferation of empires, fleets, and force-sensitive actors, made any absolute outcome unsustainable. The surviving factions realized that their efforts could only hope to shape the immediate future, stabilize sectors, and preserve their core interests. The galaxy itself had become an autonomous participant, its instability and reactions as significant as any fleet or weapon. The next phase would require choices not of dominance, but of survival strategy, resource allocation, and the management of chaos on a scale that had never existed before. In every sector, legends persisted. Captains who maneuvered entire fleets through collapsing hyperspace corridors, Jedi and Sith who survived Force Nexus collapses, and civilian leaders who maintained essential supply lines became myths whispered among survivors. Their actions inspired loyalty, fear, and hope, serving as both tactical guides and moral symbols in a galaxy that had forgotten peace. History itself had fractured, leaving only memory and observation to record the war. Written records were unreliable, maps were obsolete, and the experiences of survivors became the only consistent threads connecting past, present, and future. The eighth phase closed with the galaxy in a state of tense equilibrium. Fleets remained dispersed, sectors remained contested, and the Force continued to fluctuate unpredictably. Empires endured, but at tremendous cost. Populations were diminished, resources strained, and the cumulative effects of centuries compressed into months, or decades compressed into days, had left scars that would never heal. The galaxy was a crucible in which survival had replaced ideology, endurance had replaced conquest, and improvisation had replaced strategy. As the next phase approached, every actor, from the smallest nomadic flotilla to the largest surviving empire, faced the same question. How long could they persist in a universe that had become as much a battlefield as a participant in the war itself? The ninth phase of the war began not with grand strategy or fleet maneuvers, but with desperation. Every empire had reached the limits of its endurance, and the galaxy itself had begun to push back against further consumption. Hyperspace corridors had warped beyond recognition. Energy fields generated by repeated superweapon detonations destabilized, and force currents pulsed violently through entire sectors. Commanders who once relied on experience found themselves at the mercy of an unpredictable cosmos, where centuries of knowledge could not account for the shifting realities before them. It was no longer a battle between fleets, armies, or force-wielders. It was a battle against entropy itself. Every decision, every deployment, carried a weight far beyond immediate tactical considerations. The cost of miscalculation was annihilation, not just of units, but of entire sectors. Empires had begun to recognize that survival was no longer measured by territory or prestige, but by the ability to maintain operational continuity. Core worlds became sanctuaries, heavily fortified and stripped of extraneous infrastructure, while peripheral systems were used as expendable buffers. Populations were relocated, conscripted, or abandoned entirely, and the decisions were calculated with precision previously unthinkable. Commanders acted like mathematicians of death and endurance, weighing which fleets, which populations, which resources could be risked, and which could be sacrificed to maintain the integrity of their empire's remaining power. Fleet movements became choreographed dances of avoidance and necessity, with subspace anomalies and force disturbances treated as equally dangerous opponents as any enemy force. The Sith, as always, adapted to chaos more quickly than most. Their approach shifted from open conquest to consolidation and amplification of localized power. Strongholds became citadels of the dark side, with entire planets reshaped to maximize their influence. Dark side rituals intensified, channeling the suffering, fear, and conflict of surrounding sectors into concentrated power. Entire armadas were directed not at defeating rival fleets, but at sustaining these nexuses of influence, ensuring that their command and control remained unbroken even as the galaxy fractured. Yet this power came at a cost. Rivalries that had been suppressed for years erupted with renewed ferocity, leading to internal purges mid-campaign, entire legions destroyed to fuel personal ascensions, and apprentices turning against masters in the midst of battle. Even as they gained strength, the Sith discovered that survival demanded restraint as much as aggression. Overreach, even by a Dark Lord, could be fatal. Jedi factions faced an equally perilous landscape, though their challenges were of a different nature. The light side's influence had become fragmented and unreliable, warped by the overlapping timelines, concentrated violence, and hyperspace distortions. Meditation and foresight often returned contradictory visions, leaving even the most experienced masters uncertain. Yet Jedi had no choice but to act. Without intervention, the galaxy would descend entirely into chaos, annihilating all the fragile pockets of civilization that had endured. They had learned that small, precise actions could yield disproportionately large effects, evacuating a critical population from a collapsing system, disrupting supply chains to prevent further mass casualties, or neutralizing a rogue superweapon before it destabilized an entire sector. The scale of their responsibility had grown exponentially, and every misstep carried consequences that could ripple across light years and decades. Technological empires, deprived of force sensitivity, relied increasingly on innovation. Fleets became modular, with ships capable of functioning autonomously for months in isolation. Repair drones, automated command nodes, and predictive AI systems became the backbone of military capability. Supply lines were reimagined, with mobile refineries, orbital repair yards, and convoy systems that could adapt instantaneously to shifting hyperspace anomalies. Null zones and force-dampening fields, once experimental, had become standard equipment, essential for neutralizing force-sensitive threats during engagements. Commanders learned to manipulate these technologies not just tactically, but strategically, using hyperspace collapses, energy redirection, and force null fields to channel engagements into favorable conditions. Survival depended not on brute strength, but on precision, timing, and adaptability. Despite the extreme conditions, rogue actors, mercenaries, pirates, and nomadic flotillas continued to shape the outcome in unexpected ways. Their influence had grown because they were flexible, opportunistic, and largely unbound by the logistics and politics that constrained empires. A single flotilla could shift the balance of power in a sector by controlling a critical hyperspace junction, supplying an isolated fortress, or supplying intelligence that allowed a larger fleet to avoid disaster. These groups became pivotal players, mediating between empires, trading survival rather than ideology, and exploiting chaos for leverage. In many sectors, the most powerful commanders were not leaders of empires, but captains of independent fleets who had mastered the art of persistence in a galaxy consumed by entropy. Civilian populations, meanwhile, had either adapted or perished. Mobile cities and fortified worlds became laboratories of resilience, with social structures optimized for survival. Education focused on skill acquisition relevant to survival and defense, rather than culture or philosophy. Communities operated as integrated ecosystems. Everyone had a role, every resource was accounted for, and redundancy became critical. Art, literature, and religion survived, but their functions shifted toward morale, memory, and practical instruction rather than expression. In some isolated sectors, populations developed quasi-military cultures, where children trained from birth in defense and navigation, and every adult was a participant in the survival of the community, despite the horror surrounding them. These adaptations created pockets of civilization capable of enduring where empires could not. The ninth phase also revealed the limits of endurance for the Force itself. Nexus zones became increasingly volatile, collapsing unexpectedly and displacing fleets, entire systems, or groups of Force-sensitive individuals across space and time. Jedi and Sith attempting to manipulate these regions risked catastrophic feedback. Entire worlds could be scarred, fleets could vanish, and sentient life could be wiped from sectors without warning. The Force, once a subtle guide or tool, had become an unpredictable environmental variable, a cosmic hazard to be accounted for in every engagement. Those who could read and react to these surges gained a critical advantage, while those who ignored them found themselves annihilated by forces beyond their control. Empires continued to innovate brutally. Superweapons, once designed for decisive, symbolic destruction, were re-engineered for sustainability and flexibility. Planetary sterilization, controlled asteroid bombardment, and adaptive targeting systems became the norm. Resources were recycled ruthlessly. Destroyed worlds were mined for debris, and salvage operations were coordinated across sectors previously considered non-strategic. Logistics had become as lethal as combat itself. And the most successful empires were those capable of sustaining war across multiple unstable sectors simultaneously. Planning now incorporated probabilistic modeling for entire fleets, taking into account unpredictable hyperspace corridors, force anomalies, and rogue actors. Failure in these calculations could erase an empire overnight. Amidst all this, the galaxy's geography, both literal and metaphysical, continued to evolve. Sectors shifted in relative stability. Some systems became dead zones where neither force nor technology could operate reliably, while others crystallized as hubs of concentrated influence. These patterns, while unpredictable, provided points of strategic opportunity. Commanders who could identify and exploit these emergent structures gained a disproportionate advantage, though their control remained tenuous. Battles became concentrated around these high-value zones, each engagement carrying the potential to reshape the surrounding region for months or years. Maps, charts, and even star charts had to be constantly revised, often based on observations alone, as conventional astrogation systems proved unreliable. In these extreme conditions, new types of conflict emerged. With traditional battles impractical or suicidal, warfare became multidimensional. Cyber warfare against droid networks, forced manipulation of environmental systems, psychological operations to destabilize civilian or military morale, and precision strikes designed to cripple supply lines or command structures without engaging full fleets. Engagements were often invisible to the untrained eye. Entire sectors could change hands with minimal kinetic force, replaced instead by strategic displacement, sabotage, and the orchestration of secondary effects. The galaxy itself became a weapon, and those who mastered this abstract warfare shaped the outcome more than any fleet or weapon ever could. By the close of the ninth phase, the galaxy stood at a precipice. Fleets and empires that survived were tempered by loss, hardened by experience, and refined by necessity. The concept of victory had shifted entirely. Survival and the ability to sustain order within limited domains were more valuable than territorial gain or symbolic triumph. The Force had become both ally and hazard, its currents unpredictable yet deeply influential, dictating the flow of events with a subtle, almost conscious will. Civilizations had adapted or perished, with surviving populations exhibiting resilience that had been impossible before the convergence. Rogue actors continued to shape events, proving that flexibility and opportunism could outweigh even the mightiest fleets. This phase underscored a chilling truth that the galaxy was no longer a space of empires, ideology, or ambition alone. It had become an ecosystem of survival, where adaptability, resilience, and the capacity to endure unpredictability determined who persisted and who vanished. Every faction understood that the next stage would not be fought with firepower alone, but with strategy, foresight, and the ability to coexist with chaos long enough to maintain continuity. As the final stages loomed, commanders, force users, and civilian leaders alike prepared for the ultimate question. When the galaxy demanded a choice between survival, destruction, and transformation, which path would they take? And who would endure to define the future of all eras? The 10th phase of the Galactic War arrived like a storm without warning, but unlike any storm the galaxy had ever known. All previous calculations, strategies, and doctrines became meaningless as hyperspace itself seemed to fracture under the weight of the combined ambitions of every empire, every fleet, and every force-wielder. Stars flickered in and out of existence. Constellations that had guided civilizations for millennia warped like fluid reflections in a disturbed pond. Entire sectors simultaneously existed and ceased to exist, overlapping realities so that a fleet emerging from hyperspace might find itself not in its intended coordinates, but in a battlefield half a century out of temporal alignment. The galaxy had become a crucible, and its inhabitants the raw material. Commanders, whether Sith, Jedi, or purely technological, understood immediately that this was not just another phase of the war. This was the endgame, the final reckoning, and survival demanded adaptation that went beyond conventional tactics. They mobilized their fleets, not for conquest, but for the endurance of their entire civilization. Entire armadas that had once been symbols of dominance became modular, dispersed, and almost unrecognizable. Ships were converted mid-battle to act as mobile fortresses, repair yards, or energy relays. Drones and autonomous vessels operated independently, able to respond to threats without centralized command, guided by AI routines and predictive algorithms. Each fleet's cohesion relied not on obedience, but on survival instincts that had been honed over decades of continuous conflict. The Sith, ever opportunistic, saw in the galactic collapse both a threat and a canvas. They performed rituals of immense scale, channeling energy not just from living beings, but from the very fabric of hyperspace itself. Fleets became extensions of the dark side, as if the will of the Force could be weaponized across light years. Entire enemy formations were rerouted by invisible currents of dark energy, shields warped and disrupted, and weapons redirected against their own operators. Yet with every surge of power came a backlash. One misstep could consume a world entirely or fracture a fleet into unrecognizable fragments. Ambition had become a double-edged sword, and even the most powerful Dark Lords understood that the galaxy would no longer tolerate hubris. Alliances were formed and shattered within hours, each Sith calculating the minimum risk necessary to maintain dominance, without provoking their rivals into instant retaliation. Jedi responded with equal ingenuity, yet their focus was different. Where Sith sought to impose control, Jedi sought preservation and containment. Entire enclaves became sanctuaries not just for populations, but for reality itself, stabilizing zones where hyperspace collapses could be delayed or mitigated. Jedi Masters coordinated fleets to create living buffers, redirecting warships and energy surges to absorb destabilizing shocks before they reached critical systems. Yet the strain on the Force was immense. Meditation that had once taken minutes now required hours or days to achieve, and visions of potential futures became increasingly fragmented. Even the most disciplined Jedi could not predict outcomes, often acting on instinct, probability, and the faintest sense of continuity. Technological empires, meanwhile, had embraced the extreme. Entire sectors were transformed into autonomous fortresses, with orbital installations, energy grids, and repair yards interconnected across light years through encrypted subspace channels. Superweapons became dynamic adaptive systems, able to shift targeting algorithms in real time to compensate for reality's instability. Drones replaced fleets in some regions entirely, executing strikes with inhuman precision while avoiding hyperspace anomalies that could destroy manned vessels. AI systems learned to anticipate not just enemy movement, but the unpredictable effects of the shifting galaxy itself, effectively turning the environment into both ally and weapon. These empires survived not through ideology, but through relentless adaptation and an almost pathological attention to detail. Amid this chaos, civilian populations became critical strategic assets. Entire worlds were converted into living supply chains, not just for material resources, but for intelligence, force amplification, and the psychological resilience of the galaxy. Population centers capable of sustained production were fiercely protected, while expendable regions became staging grounds for attrition warfare. Communities learned to operate as independent microcosms of survival, their productivity and adaptability now as decisive as any fleet or army. Human and non-human societies alike demonstrated ingenuity previously unimagined, repurposing ancient structures, dormant technologies, and environmental anomalies to maintain equilibrium in an increasingly hostile cosmos. The ninth phase had already revealed the volatility of the Force, but in the 10th, that volatility became absolute. Nexus zones expanded unpredictably, sometimes consuming fleets entire, other times amplifying their power beyond reason. Sith and Jedi found themselves confronting not just each other, but the galaxy as a living, reactive entity. The Force became a battlefield in itself, with currents that could redirect hyperspace, distort gravity, or collapse planetary crusts under the strain of overconcentration. Battles were fought not just with weapons or lightsabers, but with reality itself as the canvas, and the consequences of failure extended beyond any single faction. Miscalculation could erase not only fleets, but entire cultures and timelines. Amidst this, rogue actors continued to wield influence out of proportion to their size. Mercenary flotillas, pirate syndicates, and independent warlords had long learned to exploit chaos. And in the 10th phase, their skill became indispensable. Control of a hyperspace choke point, manipulation of a disrupted energy field, or the timely provision of scarce resources could turn a sector from ruin to relative stability. These groups no longer served empires directly. Instead, they mediated survival itself, offering services to whichever faction could pay or negotiate, their allegiance fluid and unpredictable. In some cases, these actors shaped outcomes more decisively than the mightiest fleets, demonstrating that flexibility and opportunism had become as important as raw power. Individual heroes, whether Jedi, Sith, or mortal commanders, emerged in ways that transcended factional loyalty. Lightsaber duels erupted across collapsing planets, yet their consequences reverberated on an interstellar scale. Fleet captains orchestrated maneuvers that redirected entire campaigns without firing a shot. Force practitioners stabilized or destabilized hyperspace currents to grant temporary advantages to allies or sabotage rivals. Legends were formed in real time, with acts of cunning, bravery, and ingenuity shaping the future of entire regions. In the 10th phase, heroism was less about ideology and more about the capacity to act decisively in a galaxy that defied expectation. Yet even as these acts shone, the cost was unimaginable. Stars themselves became casualties, destabilized by repeated hyperspace anomalies and concentrated energy discharges. Entire systems vanished or reformed into chaotic clusters, destroying or isolating civilizations without warning. The galaxy's physical structure fractured in response to cumulative warfare, and it became clear that continued escalation could result in the annihilation of the very fabric of spacetime. Even the strongest empires recognized that the final victory would not be determined by who struck the hardest, but by who understood when to stop, when to consolidate, and when to endure. In these conditions, alliances of necessity emerged. Sith Lords and Jedi Masters, bitter rivals across centuries, occasionally coordinated in limited theaters to stabilize collapsing sectors. Technological empires worked with Force-sensitive factions to maintain critical hyperlanes. Rogue actors brokered temporary truces that ensured the survival of both civilian and military infrastructure. These fragile arrangements were built on self-interest and the recognition that no faction, however powerful, could survive the universe's current instability alone. The galaxy demanded compromise not for morality, but for the preservation of existence. At the height of the 10th phase, the cumulative pressure reached a breaking point. Massive hyperspace ruptures appeared spontaneously, connecting sectors that had never been linked and severing those that had been reliable for millennia. Superweapons detonated in unstable regions, producing gravitational scars that trapped entire fleets in localized pockets. Force surges reshaped planetary surfaces, creating zones where life could not survive and others where survival required adaptation on an unprecedented scale. Commanders had to choose between engaging enemy forces, avoiding galactic anomalies, or abandoning their objectives entirely. Each choice carried irreversible consequences. Survival became the defining metric. Empires, once driven by ideology, now focused entirely on endurance. Permanent casualties, loss of infrastructure, and attrition replaced traditional metrics of conquest. Factions that adapted quickly decentralized authority effectively, and leveraged both technology and force-sensitive strategy emerged as the most resilient. Empires that clung to rigid hierarchies, ideology, or outdated doctrines collapsed rapidly under the unrelenting pressures of the 10th phase. Survival was no longer about victory, domination, or glory. It was about maintaining functionality in a galaxy that had become actively hostile to continuity. In the final days of this phase, the galaxy became a paradoxical mosaic. Isolated sanctuaries of relative stability surrounded by chaotic, collapsing systems. Neutral zones maintained by rogue actors and mercenary fleets, and force-sensitive nexuses that acted as both stabilizers and hazards. Civilizations had learned to endure through adaptability, cooperation, and opportunistic pragmatism. Fleets had become living networks of mobility and survival rather than instruments of conquest. Superweapons had shifted from instruments of terror to tools of last resort stabilization. The galaxy had become a system of interdependent extremes, where the failure of one element could trigger cascading collapse across light years. By the end of the 10th phase, one truth was undeniable. The galaxy would never be the same. Every empire, every force tradition, every population had been reshaped by the combined pressures of simultaneous conquest, hyperspace instability, and cumulative force distortion. Victory was no longer measured in territory or fleets destroyed, but in the capacity to endure and adapt to a cosmos that had become a sentient arbiter of survival. Histories were rewritten not just by conquerors, but by the sheer act of continued existence. The surviving empires and factions had learned a brutal lesson. In a galaxy where all empires went to war at once, the ultimate victor was not the strongest, the cleverest, or the most ruthless. It was the one that could endure, adapt, and coexist within the chaos long enough to claim the future. And in this new reality, the concept of inevitability had vanished. No empire could claim destiny, no Jedi could foresee ultimate outcomes, and no Sith could impose order through fear alone. Time, space, and power itself had become fluid, and the galaxy had proven that it would allow only those capable of survival to shape what remained. Empires that endured would inherit a fractured but persistent cosmos, forced to reconcile ambition with pragmatism, doctrine with reality, and ideology with survival. The final revelation, whispered across remaining star systems and echoed in the currents of the Force, was simple yet profound. In a universe where every empire fought at once, survival itself became the ultimate dominion, and the galaxy's future was a prize no single faction could claim by right alone. The war that had consumed the galaxy left no empire untouched, no ideology untested, and no civilization unchanged. Centuries of ambition, pride, and conquest had collided simultaneously, tearing hyperspace and reality itself into a chaotic crucible. By the end, it was clear that strength alone could not guarantee survival. Adaptability, endurance, and pragmatism had become the true measures of power. Empires that had once relied on doctrine or destiny were forced to reconsider what it meant to rule, while Force-sensitive factions realized that the currents of the galaxy could no longer be predicted or controlled. Heroes and villains alike emerged not through glory, but through the ability to endure, to make impossible choices, and to navigate a cosmos reshaped by its own tumult. In the aftermath, the galaxy was no longer a stage for singular dominion. Isolated sanctuaries, rogue actors, and adaptive populations became the new pillars of continuity. The concept of inevitability had vanished. No faction could claim supremacy, and no history could be trusted. Survival had become both the burden and the reward, a harsh lesson that echoed across the stars. When all empires clash at once, victory is not defined by conquest or fear, but by the ability to endure and evolve in a galaxy that refuses to be tamed.